is obvious to the most simple-minded that Loci is of an inferior breed.
The obvious visual evidence, Commissioner, is that he is of the same breed as yourself.
Are you blind, Commander Spock? Oh, look at me.
I thought you scientists were supposed to keep an open mind.
There's a difference between keeping an open mind and believing something because you want it to be true.
Your friend Spock is a logical man.
I find your arguments strewn with gaping defects in logic.
Most illogical reaction. We demonstrated our superior weapons. They should have fled.
You mean the whole notion of logic?
Of course.
Mr. Spock, respect is a rational process. Did it ever occur to you they might react emotionally? With anger?
Doctor, I'm not responsible for their unpredictability.
You do not think like the others. There are no colors to your patterns of logic. There's only black and white.
Logical, unemotional, completely pragmatic. And we poor, irrational humans whip them in a fair fight. Now you'll find yourself back among us illogical humans again.
Which I find eminently satisfactory, Doctor. For nowhere am I so desperately needed.
Because she feels. I don't. All I know is
logic. The whole
logic.
notion of logic.
Will you try to understand how we feel about our life here? About each other?
Emotions are alien to me. I'm a scientist.
You're gonna leave here without them? Run off on some wild goose chase halfway across the galaxy just because you found a discrepancy in a hydrogen cloud?
Doctor, I'm chasing the captain, Lieutenant Uhura, and Ensign Chekhov, not some wild aquatic fowl.
Mr. Spock, you have a remarkably logical and analytical mind.
Thank you. I prefer the concrete, the graspable, the provable.
You'd make a splendid computer, Mr. Spock.
Jordan, Egypt try to mediate, stop Israeli-Palestinian escalation, report says. Jordan will host a meeting of Israeli and Palestinian representatives which aims to de-escalate and re-engage the two sides. Jordan will be the host to a meeting between Israeli and Palestinian representatives on Sunday, Jordanian news outlet Al-Ghad reported on Thursday. The newspaper quotes an informed source saying that the meeting will be attended by the representatives of Egypt and the U.S. and aims to end unilateral steps to restore political engagement between the two sides. This comes following a deadly IOF raid in Nablus and the subsequent rocket fire from Gaza into Israel earlier this week. The meeting, which will reportedly include Israelis, Palestinians, and regional and international participants, will be the first meeting of its kind in many years, per the report. Stopping all unilateral measures will be the main starting point for stopping the deterioration of the situation, and it'll be one of the main issues of discussion at the meeting. The source added that Jordan's made intensive efforts in the past to stop unilateral steps and escalating measures that would bring about more cycles of violence. Jordan also took economic and security measures to lessen the suffering of Palestinians. Diplomatic sources added that the meeting comes at a very sensitive time and is thus of major importance. The source told Al-Ghad that the meeting's a necessary step to reach Palestinian-Israeli understandings that would stop the deterioration and pave the way for more general engagement in the future. London-based Arab newspaper Al-Arabi Al-Jadid reported on Friday that Egypt had intensive contact with Palestinian factions to prevent further escalation of violence. A source told Al-Arabi Al-Jadid that the Egyptian mediators especially tried to persuade the factions in Gaza not to fire rockets into Israel, as this would only push Israel to launch a military operation in the Gaza Strip. The leaders of the Gaza factions responded by saying the principle of the unity of the theater cannot be abolished, and that the process of launching rockets will continue and may develop into other qualitative operations, according to the source. Egypt also turned to the U.S., asking them to put pressure on Israel not to escalate the violence further, this source said. And now a bit of historical framing. This is from Expose the Enemy, and it's regarding conscious opposition to Zionism around the time of World War II.
Einstein, who, along with maybe we could call them Jews of conscience, some of them might have even been Zionists of conscience, maybe you could say Einstein was that, wrote a letter, a public letter to the New York Times when Menachem Begin came to the United States. Quote, I'm going to quote that letter. This is to the New York Times, December 4th, 1948. Quote, New Palestine Party, visit of Menachem Begin and aims of political movement discussed. To the editor of the New York Times, among the most disturbing political phenomena of our time is the emergence in the newly created state of Israel of the quote-unquote Freedom Party, Tunuat Ha'erut, a political party closely akin in its organization, methods, political philosophy, and social appeal to the Nazi and fascist parties. It was formed out of the membership and following of the former Irgun Zavai Leumi, a terrorist right-wing chauvinist organization in Palestine. The current visit of Menachem Begin, leader of this party, to the United States is obviously calculated to give the impression of American support for his party in the coming Israeli elections and to cement political ties with conservative Zionist elements in the United States. Several Americans of national repute have lent their names to welcome his visit. It is inconceivable that those who oppose fascism throughout the world, if correctly informed as to Mr. Begin's political record and perspectives, could add their names in support to the movement he represents. Before irreparable damage is done by way of financial contributions, public manifestations in Begin's half, and the creation in Palestine of the impression that a large segment of America supports fascist elements in Israel, the American public must be informed as to the record and objectives of Mr. Begin and his movement. The public avowals of Begin's party are no guide whatever to its actual character. Today they speak of freedom, democracy, and anti-imperialism, whereas until recently they openly preached the doctrine of the fascist state. It is in its actions that the terrorist party betrays its real character. From its past actions, we can judge what it may be expected to do in the future. Attack on Arab village. Go, Greg.
Wow, this is worth a whole show or two, a whole show or series of shows on its own. I mean, there's a lot of parallels between then and now. Like, this whole thing is nothing new, and the people who want to misrepresent and deliberately misinform people and disinform people about like the this dynamic is nothing new. And I was even thinking about like a couple of examples of this. I know we're getting off on another tangent here, but I feel like this is a combination of like the way that these, maybe your more liberal secular Jews that are not down with the Zionist state, like they're seen as it's interesting that Netanyahu has, I'm sure he knows this history, but he's upholding Einstein as this great genius that the then Prime Minister of China, or then head of China, sees as like this great example of Jewish genius in the world and all this. And but like, Einstein, much like there's Jewish intellectuals now who are very opposed to the at least the more hardline elements of the Jewish state, the state of Israel. This was the case back then too, and it's interesting even bringing in Begin and the animosity towards Begin from these more liberal types of secular Jewish types, and then even the commonality. One more, I just name a quick parallel, would be the way that Jimmy Carter almost spoke of Begin as like having this religious supremacy around him, like he got a sense of like that Begin was a religious supremacist. He wrote about that. And then I contrast that with Jerry Falwell Sr. receiving a private jet from Begin because of the great lengths that he advanced the U.S.-Israel relationship under Begin's time as prime minister. So there's a lot of, I mean, this would be a fascinating topic to talk about more in depth because there's a lot there. But basically my point is that like this whole conflict, it's been going on for a long time. There's people who want to misrepresent or not even lay that out, like the whole idea of the monolithic conspiracy and all this, like that get lost in this. This is nothing new, and it's something that's been going on for a long time, and it's only escalated more with time and become more public because of the escalatory sense of the situation we find ourselves in now that has been building over the decades. But it's nothing new. and you can replace the names. You can replace Begin with Netanyahu. You can replace, and it becomes very similar to what we're seeing now, but even more, I'd say, more escalated now.
Yeah, and on top of that, you could just print this letter again today and just sort of replace the names, and immediately these people, such as Albert Einstein, who Netanyahu takes as the Jewish people who produce such geniuses as Albert Einstein on this letter, or Hannah Arendt, one of the most important moral philosophers of the 20th century, Jewish woman. And these people would immediately be un-Jewed by the Natan Sharansky credibly accused Soviet police agent types, who then, by the way, I went on this Zoom call yesterday while I was doing other things by the Institute of Anti-Semitism Studies, and they were, the main presenter, an academic guy, was basically doing this whole drafting off of a woman's Soviet studies in terms of sort of Soviet architecture of aspects of anti-Semitism in conjunction with anti-Westernism and anti-imperialism, was basically giving a line very similar to what we saw in the Jerusalem presentation of the Daily Wire, the Shapiro and Jordan Peterson event. And so then I had time to pose a question in the Q&A part in terms of, I wrote it down and I said, will you address the issue of Herzl's anti-Semitism and call of the fascists, the calls to saying that the anti-Semites will be our best friends, or Jabotinsky's calls for fascist overtones of iron in relationship to the relationship of Zionism, the history of Zionism in terms of anti-Semitism and authoritarianism, because that was also a part of it. And then after that, they didn't read the question. But then Christine Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's sister, and one of these, key people, actually, in terms of, even more key than Ghislaine herself, in terms of the Israeli military intelligence sector and its relationship with Silicon Valley, especially Microsoft, deep, the Talpiot twins, as we titled them, Christine and Isabel. She comes on after to basically just high-five these other folks. Now, there was some pushback there, but this whole aspect, the rise again of weaponized, really sort of Zionist propaganda-based, I think, anti-Semitism studies, and the total, I would say, the total moral hypocrisy at its core, and what it's not willing to talk about in terms of the internal history of Zionist politics, is proof positive that this exact discourse in this letter from many decades ago is more relevant than ever.
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
And it's definitely the case that these Jews who wrote this letter to the New York Times would definitely be called self-hating Jews, un-Jewed, dupes of anti-Semites worldwide, and all of that kind of thing. And meanwhile, this letter would be even more powerful today because they were proven exactly right in terms of what would happen if the people, with the Jewish people and the American government and the American people, were to accept these fascist terrorists. They're very clear. They use language like terrorism, fascism, supremacism. I think they use at some point that this was going to indicate a very bad move. And now we have just decades and decades of even deepening and worsening historical proof that they were correct. Now we've got decades of more ethnic cleansing, more decades of military occupation, more decades of terrorism, of really security destroying espionage in relationship to the indispensable ally of the United States. We've got attempts to assassinate Jewish American ambassadors. We have credibly accused big terrorism. Like Menachem Begin, it was like the Netanyahu types were like, Menachem Begin, hold my beer. Watch this global terrorism. And now, like you brought up, Greg, now there's a whole nother part of this where we have this contemporary political context where it's not just this analysis. Now there's this whole other analysis of authoritarianism and this transnational aspect that then is related to this multipolar turn, especially between these, amongst these figures of people like Putin, Netanyahu, Trump, Orban, Bolsonaro, this whole Modi, that whole aspect, Xi, and so this is this has been heightened, and I think that actually we're probably at the height since that time of the potential calling into serious focus the real threat of what is going on in terms of this what's become of this Zionist project. And more, and another story that just came out is this is an international consortium of journalists exposing, quote, hacks, bots, and blackmail, how secret cyber mercenaries disrupt elections. And this is coming out all over the place. In terms of The Guardian, it's coming out in Haaretz and Times of Israel, French newspapers, and this is an expose of a key Israeli political warfare cyber cell. And mainly two brothers call themselves Team Jorge, and they claim to have worked on intelligence and influence services and that worked on 33, that's an interesting number, presidential level campaigns, 27 of them, quote unquote, successful. Their tactics include hacking, forging blackmail material, spreading disinformation, planning false intelligence, physically disrupting elections, and deploying targeted social media campaigns. And Jorge has been exposed as Atal Hanan, a self-described counterterrorism expert who has been cited in the media as a cybersecurity specialist, and his brother. And that we'll link to some of these stories, but it turns out he was linked in, of course, with Cambridge Analytica and that whole central political warfare component of the 11/9 operation. So this is getting exposed. This is beginning to escalate. The exposure of this, the politics domestically inside of Israel, the growing concern inside of the United States in terms of, politically focused people committed to freedom and democracy, but also people committed to national security. So things are coming to a head, and so that's one reason I wanted to actually that set me off when I saw Bibi reference Einstein, and because I remember this letter and I used to reference it a lot because it's such a stunning piece in terms of sort of how things have changed, but also how they've stayed the same in many ways.
Yes, and looking at this from a domestic American standpoint, I mean, look at 1948 and 2022, or 2023 now, and in this situation, you still had the quote unquote democratic, and there was no way this could come to America or the quote unquote stabilized Western countries. Yes, of course, there's been long-term collaboration, and obviously the original sins of the recognition of Israel and the power that the Israel lobby through media and government would have over our institutions and over our politicians. And there's been periods where it's been more pronounced than other periods, maybe during the presidency of a Lyndon Johnson or certainly George W. Bush. But now we've reached the situation where, in addition to all of this, there's been this long-term weaponized destabilizing of the West of Western Europe, but in general, I'd say, but the United States in particular, to the point to where someone who is just the where you have the rise of a Trump-like figure. We're not only in a situation where he's in office but is out of office, tried to stage a coup against the government that was going to be following him into power, and now has the opportunity to be installed back into power. And not just Donald Trump, but basically you've got a primary where it's going to be Trump-like people who may not behave like him. They may be more polished than him, more respectable in the way they speak publicly, but they're beholden to this same agenda and to these same interests. And so we've got where now like an entire subset of our political culture, or one of our major two political institutionalized parties, is now entirely full of people that would lead us into this direction, whether it's Donald Trump doing it or not. You've got a whole bunch of would-be Trumps in waiting. And so it's really, that's another part of the escalatory nature of this, just how infiltrated and taken over our political system has become. Not just the usual bipartisan corruption, but now where like an entire political party and its politicians and representatives and everything that comes with it are pretty much entirely taken over. And so that's where we're facing in this moment, in addition to all the other ways that it's escalated. Like now we've got the threats of foreign, but now you've got it right here, and it's, I'd say, taken over a very significant portion of our society.
Definitely. And Greg, I want to finish this letter if that's okay. I just think it makes sense to sort of complete it.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. And remember, this is from this is the Freedom Party, right, that they're calling out Menachem Begin. So from the Freedom Party to the Freedom Caucus, I don't know. All right, back to this letter. I think it was printed on December 4th, 1948, but they wrote it on December 2nd, or they signed it on and sent it in on December 2nd. Okay, quote, "Attack on Arab village. A shocking example was their behavior in the Arab village of Deir Yassin. This village, off the main roads and surrounded by Jewish lands, had taken no part in the war, and had even fought off Arab bands who wanted to use the village as their base. On April 9th, in the New York Times, they're sourcing the New York Times, terrorist bands attacked this peaceful village, which was not a military objective in the fighting, killed most of its inhabitants, 240 men, women, and children, and kept a few of them alive to parade as captives through the streets of Jerusalem. Most of the Jewish community was horrified at the deed, and the Jewish agency sent a telegram of apology to King Abdullah of Transjordan. But the terrorists, far from being ashamed of their act, were proud of this massacre, publicized it widely, and invited all the foreign correspondents present in the country to view the heaped corpses and the general havoc at Deir Yassin. The Deir Yassin incident exemplifies the character and actions of the Freedom Party. Within the Jewish community, they have preached an admixture of ultranationalism, religious mysticism, and racial superiority. Like other fascist parties, they have been used to break strikes, and they have themselves pressed for the destruction of free trade unions. In their stead, they have proposed corporate unions on the Italian fascist model. During the last years of sporadic anti-British violence, the IZL and Stern groups inaugurated a reign of terror in the Palestine Jewish community. Teachers were beaten up for speaking against them. Adults were shot for not letting their children join them. Unquote. By the way, this is right. This is exactly what they accuse Hamas of in terms of the Palestinian community, right, or Islamic Jihad, or just any usually sort of any kind of organized Palestinian organization, right? But this is the origins also of the quote-unquote security state of Israel too. All right.
And not also, but the origins period. Like to say that Hamas is doing that, there's no proof of that. It could be could be projection, especially considering that this is well before Hamas was established, that this was written objectively. And once again, as I always point out, it's
Zionists don't preserve Jews from their targets of terrorism and destruction. Sometimes they will target them, potentially. All right, quote, teachers were beaten up for speaking against them. Adults were shot for not letting their children join them. By gangster methods, beatings, window smashing, and widespread robberies, the terrorists intimidated the population and exacted a heavy tribute. The people of the Freedom Party had no part in the constructive achievements in Palestine. They have reclaimed no land, built no settlements, and only detracted from the Jewish defense activity. Their much publicized immigration endeavors were minute and devoted mainly to bringing in fascist compatriots. Discrepancies seen. The discrepancies between the bold claims now being made by Begin and his party and their record of past performance in Palestine bear the imprint of no ordinary political party.
Your inconsistencies
This is the
are glaringly
stamp
obvious.
of a fascist party for whom terrorism against Jews, Arabs, and British alike, and misrepresentation are means, and a quote-unquote leader state is the goal. In the light of the foregoing considerations, it is imperative that the truth about Mr. Begin and his movement be made known in this country. It is all the more tragic that the top leadership of American Zionism has refused to campaign against Begin's efforts, or even to expose to its own constituents the dangers to Israel from support to Begin. The undersigned therefore take this means of publicly presenting a few salient facts concerning Begin and his party, and of urging all concerned not to support this latest manifestation of fascism. And then it lists
And finally, we have George Galloway on Zionism.
I don't think they've failed at all to understand it. Zionism is Jewish nationalism, and the British, in the form of the Balfour Declaration, endorsed Zionism by granting, on behalf of one people, land to a second people, which belonged to a third people, and which didn't even fall in the British Empire at the time that the promise was made. So it was unique even by imperial standards for that time. Balfour, on behalf of the British, promised the Zionists on behalf of the Jewish people of the world, though most of them were not Zionists and many of them were viscerally hostile to Zionism, the land which belonged to a third people, the Palestinian people. So I don't think it's that they don't understand it. They support it. They support it because, in the words of one of Balfour's cabinet colleagues, it would produce a loyal British Ulster in the Middle East, and so it did. Now it's a loyal American statelet in the Middle East, and that's something to have. And for a long time it threatened and countermanded, or undermined rather, the relations of the British and the Americans with the Arab world, but it doesn't really any longer, at least not with the rulers of the Arab world, who've all made their peace with Zionism. So now that that is the case, it's full speed ahead in support of Israeli nationalism, which is all that Zionism now really. I don't.
And I'd like to see what happens with this Jordan, Egypt, Israel, Palestine meeting coming up next week. Yeah, but with that.